There are things a man does not forgive himself for. I have a list. It is not short. Near the top of it, not at the top, but near it, is the fact that for 6 weeks I hid in the trees like a poacher and watched a young woman love my son and said nothing. I tell myself now that there was a reason, that I was making sure Edmund was safe, that the lane beyond the eastern wall was technically part of the Calenmore lands, and it was within my rights as his father and as the Duke of Calenmore to stand in the shadow of my own oaks and observe my own child. I tell myself these things. My closest friend Hartwell, when I finally told him the truth of it, the whole truth, the watching and the waiting and what came of it, looked at me for a long moment and said, "Gideon, you hid in the trees for 6 weeks." He said it the way a man says something that does not require further comment. And he was right. It did not require further comment. But I am getting ahead of myself. I should tell you what Edmund was in those days, so that you understand what the seeing of him meant. He was 5 years old, and he was the quietest child I had ever encountered. Not the quiet of contentment, not the quiet of a boy absorbed in play or building something with blocks on a carpet, wholly engaged. It was the quiet of a child who had learned very early that the world was not a place that responded to noise. His mother had been dead for 3 years. He had been 2 when she died, and I am not sure how much he remembered of her, almost nothing. The physician said at that age, the memory does not hold in the way we want it to, but children feel the shape of an absence even when they cannot name it. Eleanor's absence was a very particular shape. She had been warmth itself, laughter in hallways, flowers on every sill. She had been the reason Calenmore Hall did not feel like a stone edifice, but felt, instead, like a place where people lived. When she died of a fever in December, in 5 days that went from worrying to desperate to impossible before I could draw breath, the warmth went out of the hall as if a fireplace had been sealed. Edmund felt it. He was only 2, and he felt it. He became quiet. And I was not better than my house. I was, in the years after Eleanor died, a colder man than I had any right to be. The estate tenants called me the Cold Duke, and not without cause. I managed Calenmore with efficiency and without warmth. I attended to Edmund's physical needs with care and to his emotional needs with a kind of helpless, guilty silence, because I did not know how to be the warmth he needed. I had been the one who leaned on Eleanor for that. I had not understood until she was gone how much of the house and the child and the life had been her doing, and how little I knew of doing it myself. I visited Edmund each morning. I read to him in the evenings when I was not in London on estate business. I made sure he had the best nurses, the best food, the proper clothes. I did not know how to make him laugh. I was not a bad father. I want to be precise. I was a grieving man who had become cold, and a cold man who loved his son but did not know how to show it in any way that reached a 5-year-old boy who needed warmth above everything else in the world. That is the precise truth of it. It was Dawson, my head groundsman, who first told me that Edmund had been slipping through the eastern gate. Not often, twice in the first week of May, and then a third time. The gate in the eastern wall was an old postern in the kitchen garden wall. The latch was stiff enough that a grown man needed a firm grip, but not so stiff that a determined small boy could not work it loose if he put his mind to the task. Edmund had apparently put his considerable mind to the task. Dawson had found him outside the gate on a Tuesday morning, sitting on the grass of the lane that ran along the eastern wall, and had led him back in without incident. On Friday of the same week, he found him outside again. I told Mrs. Hargrove, the head nurse, to have the gate latch repaired. The latch was repaired. It was repaired on a Saturday. By Monday, Edmund had found a loose stone in the wall 2 yards east of the gate, not large enough for a grown man to squeeze through, but quite sufficient for a 5-year-old boy of slight build. And Dawson found him outside again, sitting on the grass of the lane, in the exact same place he had sat before. I went to the lane that afternoon. I told myself I was going to assess the wall and determine whether Dawson's report of the loose stone was accurate. This was not entirely a lie. The stone was indeed loose, and I pressed it with my palm and felt it give, and made a mental note to have the mason come. But what I was really doing was trying to understand what it was about the lane that drew the boy out. It was not, by any measurable standard, a remarkable lane. It was a dirt track that ran along the eastern wall of the estate, bounded on the far side by a line of chestnut oaks and a ditch that filled with water after rain and dried in June to a stripe of cracked mud. The oaks were large and old. In May they were heavy with new leaf, and the light came through them in pieces that moved across the ground. There were wildflowers in the grass, common ones, clover and cowslip and the occasional splash of red campion. If you looked south along the lane, you could see where it curved toward the village of Aldervane, half a mile away. If you looked north, you saw nothing but the wall and the oaks and the lane winding into the distance. Edmund was not there when I came. I stood in the lane and looked at the oaks and the wildflowers and thought that a small boy with an absent mother and a cold father and too much silence in his life might come to a place like this simply because it was outside, because it was not the house. I went back through the gate, which the mason had not yet reached, and I let the loose stones sit. I did not go to the lane again for 3 days. On the 4th day, a Thursday in the 2nd week of May, I walked out of the kitchen garden in the middle of the afternoon, crossed the grass to the wall, and went through the gap in the stones. I do not know what I was doing. I was Duke of Calenmore. I had 700 acres of ground I could walk on the right side of the wall. I was going through a hole in my own kitchen garden wall like a schoolboy playing truant, but I went. And he was there. He was sitting in the grass under the nearest chestnut oak, the largest of them, the one whose roots had pushed up through the lane's surface so that the dirt road went around them, and he was not alone. She was sitting beside him in the grass. I registered several things at once, in the way a man does when he comes upon something unexpected, that she was young, younger than I had anticipated. I had not anticipated anyone at all, but if pressed I would have said Dawson's wife or one of the village women, and this was neither. That she was plainly dressed, in a gray walking dress and a dark cloak that was too heavy for May but not so heavy as to be eccentric. That she had brown hair pinned up under a simple bonnet, with a strand or two that had come loose and curled against the side of her neck in a way that meant they had been loose for some time and she had not noticed, or had noticed and not minded. That she was not looking at Edmund but at the oak tree above them, pointing at something, a bird, I would discover later, a chaffinch in the upper branches, and speaking in a low voice as she pointed. Edmund was looking at the bird. I have said that Edmund was quiet. I should add that I had not, in 3 years, seen him sit comfortably beside another person who was not his nurse. He was not a child who liked being touched after a leaner died. He tolerated Mrs. Hargrove's practical attentions because they were practical and he understood they were necessary. He did not seek out proximity. He did not lean. If I sat beside him on the nursery floor to read, he sat at an angle, turned slightly away, as if he was listening but preserving the option of departure. He had his mother's pale brown eyes and his mother's careful way of holding himself, and he used that careful posture as a kind of armor. He was leaning against the young woman's arm. Not dramatically, not in the collapsed, trusting way of a child who has fallen asleep. He was just leaning, the side of his shoulder touching the side of her arm, his head tilted slightly toward her as she pointed at the chaffinch. His eyes on the bird, and his small body present beside her in a way it was not present with anyone at Calenmore Hall, including me. I stopped at the eastern end of the gap in the wall, out of sight behind the stone. I was not hiding. I was simply not moving. And when I did not move and she did not turn and Edmund's eyes stayed on the chaffinch, I stayed still. She said something about the bird. I could not quite hear. The wind was from the east, taking the words away from me, but I saw Edmund's shoulders shift in a way that meant something had amused him. Not quite a laugh. Edmund did not quite laugh in those days. But his shoulders shifted and his chin tucked slightly, and that was the Edmund version of being amused, and I knew it when I saw it, and I had not seen it in longer than I could account for. I stood in the shadow of the wall, and I did not move. They stayed under the oak for, I think, 3/4 of an hour. She told him a story. I caught fragments of it on the wind. Something about a fox who had lost his tail and was embarrassed about it. A story clearly invented as she went, because the logic of it kept shifting in ways that made Edmund's shoulders do the thing they did. She showed him a clover flower and explained something about it, how it was made, the parts of it, with the kind of absorbed attention that meant she found it genuinely interesting and was not performing interest for his benefit. She found a flat stone and showed him how to make it skip, even in grass, which required dragging it across the surface in a way that did not actually work. And she laughed at her own failure at it, and Edmund stared at the failed stone with great seriousness, as if he was solving the problem in his head. When the church clock in Aldervane struck 3, she dusted the grass from her skirt and stood. She said something to Edmund. I caught time and go and tomorrow, and he stood as well, and she reached down and straightened his collar, which had gone crooked, with the swift, unself-conscious competence of someone who straightens collars as naturally as breathing. Then she smiled at him. I saw the smile from 40 yards away, and I could not have described it precisely, but I could tell you that it was warm and genuine, and not a thing produced for the purpose of being seen. It was the smile of a woman who had spent an afternoon under an oak tree with a child and found, genuinely, that it was a good afternoon. Edmund watched her walk down the lane toward Aldervane until she went around the curve of the oaks and was out of sight. Then he turned and went back through the gap in the wall, and I stepped aside to let him pass, and he went by without looking up, because he was deep inside his own thoughts, and because it had not occurred to him that anyone was there. I stood in the lane for another minute after he had gone through. The chaffinch sang twice in the oak above me. The wind came from the east and moved the grasses along the wall. I looked at the place in the grass where they had sat, where two flattened impressions remained, one small, one a little larger, side by side. Then I went back through the wall and went back to the house, and sat in my library for a long time, not reading. I should have gone out to the lane and introduced myself the next day. I understand this. I understood it that evening in the library, and I understood it the following morning, and I understand it now with the perfect clarity of a man looking backward. She did not know whose child she was befriending. She would have wanted to know. She would have been reassured, and so would I, and the practical matter of Edmund's excursions beyond the wall could have been managed with a direct conversation and a polite arrangement. I did not go out to introduce myself. On the following Thursday, Edmund having located the lane again on the Wednesday, and the young woman having apparently been there to meet him, I went back through the gap in the wall and stood in the shadow of the stone. I told myself the first time had been chance. I told myself the second time was due diligence. I did not go back a third time for 2 days, and when I went back a third time, I did not tell myself anything at all. I simply went. I did not go every day. I was not a man who abandoned his responsibilities to stand in a lane. But I went often enough over the weeks that followed to learn a great deal about the young woman who sat under the oak with my son, and to learn it all at the distance of 40 yards, through a gap in a kitchen garden wall, without ever once saying a word to her. Her name I would eventually learn from Mrs. Hargrove, who had it from the cook, who had it from the dairy girl who was from Aldervane. Her name was Elara Wren. She was an orphan of 19 or 20, which I found difficult to reconcile with how capable and settled she seemed. But Dawson told me later that orphans who have managed since childhood tend to wear their age the way some people wear experience, not as weariness but as competence. She had been working for the past year and a half at Aldervane Rectory, tending the vicar's 3 children while the vicar's wife was in poor health. She had no family in the village. She had come from the next county when the position was offered, and had stayed because there was no particular reason to go, and because she was good with children in the way that some people are good with horses. Not through technique, but through instinct, through some quality of attention that the children felt and responded to. I learned her name on a Friday at the end of the 3rd week. I had, by then, already learned a number of other things. I had learned that she arrived at the lane at the same time every afternoon when her duties at the rectory permitted, between 1 o'clock and 2, usually, and that she always walked from Aldervane on the far side of the oaks, and that she always stopped at the largest oak, the one with the raised roots, as if by agreement. I had learned that Edmund was always there when she arrived, or arrived within minutes. He had found a way to monitor the lane from somewhere within the kitchen garden, through a gap in the garden's own inner hedge that I had not known existed. I had learned that Edmund would not allow her to fix his collar a second time on any given afternoon, only the first, but that he did not actually move away when she reached for it, only stood still with a resigned dignity that I recognized because it was exactly what I did when Hartwell pointed out that my cravat was crooked. I had learned, and this one I held quietly and privately, turning it over in the evenings, that she had a particular quality of stillness when Edmund spoke. He did not speak often or at great length. He was a quiet child. But when he did speak, pointing at something, asking something, offering a careful observation about a beetle or the shape of a cloud, she gave him her complete attention. Not the performed attention of an adult demonstrating attentiveness to a child. The actual thing. Her eyes on his face, the rest of the world paused, as if what he had said was genuinely interesting and she was thinking about it. Edmund noticed. Children always notice the difference. I noticed too. In the 4th week, on a Tuesday, Edmund fell. He had been climbing on the raised roots of the oak. He did this regularly now, with the air of a man surveying his property, standing on the topmost root and looking over the lane as if checking whether anything new had appeared, and he stepped wrong on a wet root and came down hard on his knee on the lane surface. He did not make a sound. Edmund never made a sound when he was hurt. He simply went still, and the stillness got more complete, and I knew from the nursery that this was the sign that he was in pain. She was at his side before I had finished processing what had happened. She knelt in the dirt of the lane, in her good gray dress, without hesitation. She put her knees directly into the dirt and the wet grass at the base of the root and looked at his knee. And she spoke to him in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that is not soothing in the soft, performative way, but is simply calm, which is a different thing. Then she produced a clean handkerchief from her cloak pocket. She always had one. I had noticed this, and folded it into a pad and pressed it against the knee, and Edmund sat very still and let her. He did not cry. He was 5 years old and he did not cry, and I did not know whether to be proud of him or heartbroken, because I could not remember the last time I had seen him cry, and a child who does not cry has often decided, somewhere in the private rooms of himself, that crying does not accomplish anything useful. She said something to him. He shook his head slightly. She said something else. He shook his head again. Then she said something that I am sure was completely different from anything she had said before, because Edmund's head came up and he looked at her with an expression I can only describe as startled suspicion, as if he was not sure whether she had just said something absurd and was preparing to dispute it. She said it again, whatever it was. Edmund considered for a long moment, and then, with the great deliberateness of a boy who is not sure whether to commit to this, he nodded. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, still holding the handkerchief to his knee, and she smiled. The smile again. The one I had been cataloging for 4 weeks without admitting to myself that I was cataloging it. I put my hand against the stone wall and held it there. I do not know what to call what I was feeling at that moment, precisely. I know what I would call it now, with everything that came after. But in the moment I only knew that I was standing against a wall I should have walked through a month ago, watching a woman press a folded handkerchief to my son's knee in the dirt of a lane, and something inside me that had been clenched for 3 years was doing something that felt uncomfortably like the early stages of unclenching. I did not go through the wall. I went back to the house and told Dawson to have the mason look at the loose stone that week. The mason came on Wednesday, inspected the wall, and reported that the stone was more firmly set than Dawson had thought and would not need replacing for some years. I thanked him and said nothing else. Hartwell visited on the 2nd Friday of June. He was my oldest friend. We had been at school together, and he had the particular immunity of old friendship, which is to say that he could say things to me that other men could not say and expect to survive the conversation. He arrived in the early afternoon, examined my face over the welcome glass of wine, and said, "You look peculiar." I said that I was perfectly well. He said, "You look as though you have discovered something that you don't know what to do with." I said that I had several matters of estate business on my mind. He accepted this with the expression of a man who accepts a statement for the sake of company, and reserves the right to return to the matter later. We had dinner and spoke of London, and spoke of Hartwell's own estate, and spoke of a bill before Parliament that affected both of us. I did not say anything about the lane. After dinner in the library with the fire and the port, Hartwell asked after Edmund. I said Edmund was well. Hartwell watched me for a moment. "Is he?" I turned the glass in my hands. I said, "He has been going outside the eastern wall, through a gap in the kitchen garden wall, to a lane that runs along the oak trees." I paused. "He has been there as a young woman from the village, a nursemaid at the rectory. She has been there in the afternoons." Hartwell waited. "She sits with him," I said. "Under the oak, she tells him stories and shows him things." "She fixed his collar." I stopped, aware that I had said fixed his collar as if this were significant data, which in my accounting it was. Hartwell said, in the careful voice of a man choosing words, "And you know this because—" "Because I've been watching," I said. "I followed him the first day to make sure he was safe, and then I set the glass down. I kept going back." There was a long silence. "Through the gap in the wall," Hartwell said. "Yes." "Without introducing yourself." "Yes." He looked at me with the expression I mentioned earlier, the one that said the situation did not require further comment. Then he said, "How long?" "5 weeks. Gideon." "I know. You are the Duke of Calenmore," he said, "and you have been peering through your own garden wall at a nursemaid for 5 weeks without." "I did not peer," I said, with what dignity I could manage. "I stood at a gap in the wall and observed." Hartwell refilled his glass. He said slowly, "You should introduce yourself." I said that I intended to. He said, "Tomorrow." I said that perhaps the week after, as I had a great deal of estate business. He looked at me with a kind of patient, exasperated affection that was the face of a man who has known another man for 30 years, and is not surprised, but is disappointed. He said, "What is it that is stopping you?" I did not answer immediately because the answer was complicated and I was not sure I had the language for it. I said, finally, "She doesn't know who he is, who I am. She doesn't know any of it, and because she doesn't know, she just is with him, without managing him or being careful around him or treating him differently because he's the Duke's son and must be handled properly. She just sits with him in the grass and tells him about foxes and looks at beetles with him," and I stopped. Hartwell said quietly, and he leans against her arm. I looked up. "Mrs. Hargrove told my housekeeper," he said. "Who told me? The woman in the lane. Edmund apparently told Mrs. Hargrove that the lady knows about chaffinches." He paused. "He told Mrs. Hargrove that the lady's handkerchief smells like lavender." I set the glass down. "He's talking about her," Hartwell said. "Edmund is talking to Mrs. Hargrove, which I understand he doesn't often do." The fire was very quiet. I could hear the clock on the mantel. "She gave something back to him," I said. It was not a thing I had intended to say out loud. "Whatever she did in those afternoons, she gave something back to him that I couldn't, that I didn't know how to give him." Hartwell said nothing for a moment. Then go and thank her for it." I said nothing. "Gideon," he said gently, "go through the wall, tomorrow. Go through the wall and say your name and thank the woman for her kindness to your son." I picked up the glass again. I turned it in my hands. I said, "What if she stops?" Hartwell looked at me. "What if, when she knows who he is, who I am, what if the not knowing is the thing that makes it work? And when she knows, something changes?" A long silence. Hartwell, to his credit, considered this genuinely rather than dismissing it. Then he said, "You cannot keep the boy's life a secret from the woman who is caring for him on the lane. That is not a permanent arrangement." I said I knew that. He said, "Then go." I went to bed that night and lay awake, looking at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Calenmore Hall is an old house, and it settles with sound, wood and stone, and the faint groan of old timbers in the night wind. Eleanor had loved the sound of it. She had said it was the house talking to itself, reviewing its own day. I had not heard it that way for 3 years. I heard it that way now, lying in the dark, and I thought about a woman sitting in the grass under an oak tree with a handkerchief that smelled of lavender, and my son leaning against her arm, and something that had been clenching in me for 3 years, and how it felt when it began to unclench. I thought too about what Hartwell had said, that Edmund was talking. That Edmund had told Mrs. Hargrove about the lavender handkerchief and the chaffinch. Mrs. Hargrove, who had been Edmund's nurse since he was 3 months old, who was a composed and capable woman whose report of anything was reliable. Edmund had told her. Edmund had volunteered the information, which meant he had wanted it known. Which meant that the afternoons in the lane were not a secret he was guarding, but a good thing he was holding, the way a child holds a good thing, wanting to name it to someone, wanting it witnessed. I lay awake for a long time. I thought about the stone in the wall still loose, about Dawson's report, about the mason I had not called. I thought about the afternoon I had stood in the gap and watched Edmund climb the root and sit too close to the edge, the way he always did, testing some private boundary of caution in the way 5-year-old boys do, and how Miss Wren had said without drama or alarm, "Edmund, down from there, please," in the tone of someone who says it because it is sensible rather than because she is afraid. And Edmund had come down without argument because she had not made it a confrontation, only a direction. He never came down for me without at least a moment's delay and a weighing of the request, because with me everything was a little formal, a little carefully negotiated. With her it was easy. I wanted to know how she did that. I wanted to sit close enough to ask her. I did not go to the lane the following day. I went the day after. I tell myself there were good reasons for the delay. I had a meeting with the estate steward on the Thursday morning that ran long, and by the time it was finished, the afternoon was already pressing on, and I was being dishonest. I delayed because I was afraid, and I am not a man who is often afraid, and not knowing what to do with the fear was part of what made it worse. The Duke of Calenmore does not hide in walls. The Duke of Calenmore does not feel the particular flutter of something that is not quite anxiety when he contemplates stepping through a gap in a kitchen garden wall. And yet, on the Friday I went. I went at 1:15, which meant I arrived at the gap in the wall before Edmund, and I stood in the shadow of the oaks and waited for them to come. I stood there for 20 minutes, through which time I rehearsed with some attention what I intended to say. I am the Duke of Calenmore. This is my son, Edmund. I am grateful for your kindness to him. I believe introductions are overdue. Various versions. None of them sounded right, but they all sounded like things that could be said by a man standing in a lane in June. I heard Edmund before I saw him, the faint sound of the loose stone being moved, the scrape of it, and then his footsteps in the grass. He came through the gap and crossed the lane to the oak root, and climbed to the top of it in his usual proprietorial way, and stood there surveying the lane. He did not see me in the shadow of the trees. Then she came around the curve of the oaks, walking quickly the way she always walked, as if she had somewhere useful to be and was interested in getting there. She stopped when she saw Edmund on the root. She smiled. Edmund saw her and climbed down from the root with the deliberateness of a boy who has been waiting, and is not going to show that he has been waiting. And they met in the grass in the middle of the lane with the naturalness of two people who have been doing this for weeks and have no longer any need to establish the terms of it. She said something, he said something. She reached into her cloak pocket and produced, I could not see what at first, but then I did, a small book, pocket-sized. She held it up and Edmund looked at it and then at her and then at the book, and his expression was the one he made when something interested him very much and he was not yet prepared to admit it. I stepped out of the shadow. I think she heard me first, the creak of a branch underfoot, which was a particular irony for a man who had been managing his silence in that spot for 6 weeks. She turned, and I came out of the shadow, and she saw me. I must have been a strange sight. A large man in a dark coat stepping out of the oaks in a country lane would give most people pause. She held herself still, not alarmed exactly, but very alert, the way a person is alert when they cannot yet determine whether something is a problem. Her hand did not move toward Edmund, but her body did the faintest shift of weight that positioned her between me and the boy. I noticed that. Edmund turned and saw me, and his face went through something complicated, and then he said, in the particular tone he used for facts that he had not told anyone, "Father." I think she did not move for a full moment after that. I came down the lane the remaining yards and stopped at a distance that was not threatening. I said, "Miss Wren." My voice was even. I had practiced for 20 minutes and it was even. "I owe you an introduction that I have failed to make for some considerable time." She looked at me, she looked at Edmund, she looked at me again. I said, "I am Gideon Ashcroft, the Duke of Calenmore. Edmund is my son." I paused. I should have said so 6 weeks ago. A silence. She said 6 weeks. It was not a question. It was a number spoken aloud by a woman who was doing arithmetic. "Yes," I said. Edmund, who had been watching the two of us with the calm watchfulness of a diplomat at a particularly delicate conference, said, "Father watches from the wall," in a tone of helpful clarification. I looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at me with the face of a child who has reported a fact accurately and sees no reason why an accurate report of a fact should cause any difficulty. She made a sound. I looked back at her. She had pressed her hand over her mouth, and above her hand her eyes had an expression that I could not immediately interpret, which resolved a moment later into something that was not anger, not alarm. It was the expression of a person who has just understood the shape of a situation they had been in without knowing it, and is deciding how they feel about it. I said, "I understand that this is not ideal." She lowered her hand. "You watched," she said carefully, from behind the wall. "Yes. For 6 weeks. Yes. And you chose not to introduce yourself." I looked at her steadily. I said I did. She looked at Edmund, who was still watching us with his diplomat's attention. She said, "Were you well enough hidden?" I said, "Reasonably." Something crossed her face, a quick involuntary thing there and gone, not a smile. Something that wanted to be a smile and was being suppressed. I said, I owe you an apology and an explanation if you will hear one. I stopped. I had not intended to say the next part, which was, he leaned against you. He has not done that with anyone since his mother died. I saw it the first day and I did not want to change it. The lane was very quiet. The chaffinch was somewhere in the oaks, and the wind moved through them with the sound that old trees make when they are not entirely still. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Edmund, and her expression was the one I had catalogued for 6 weeks. The warm, genuine thing that was not performed, and was not for anyone's benefit but her own. She said, Edmund, he looked up, you have a father who loves you very much. Edmund considered this. He looked at me with those careful pale brown eyes that were Aline's eyes, and then he said, I know. He said it in the matter-of-fact way of a child reporting something he has known for some time. He fixed the wall stone so Dawson would not patch the gap. I had told Dawson the mason's report. I had told Dawson that the stone did not need replacing yet. Edmund had apparently noticed that the stone remained loose. Alara Wren looked at me with an expression that now contained a definite element of amusement and possibly also a small amount of something else. She said, Did he now? I said with what I hoped was dignity. The mason assessed it as structurally sound. Edmund said, You told Dawson you didn't want the gap filled. Edmund had, it was clear, been listening to more conversations than I had known. He was a very quiet child, and very quiet children, I was learning, hear a great deal. Alara said, Your Grace. Her voice had settled from the first careful alertness into something softer, more measured. Would you like to sit with us? I had not expected that. I had expected, if things went well, to be forgiven, to shake hands, perhaps. To arrange, in a formal and appropriate manner, for her continued acquaintance with Edmund if she were willing, and to leave the lane and go back through the wall and conduct the subsequent management of my son's friendship at a proper distance. I had not expected to be invited to sit in the grass under the chestnut oak, as if I were a perfectly ordinary person who had arrived at a perfectly ordinary afternoon gathering. I said, That is, yes, if it would not be intrusive. She said, Edmund, is it all right if your father joins us? Edmund looked at me again with the diplomatic patience. He said, He has to sit on the root side. I sit by Miss Alara. She said, Those are the terms. I said, The terms are acceptable. And so I sat on the root side of the chestnut oak, which meant the large raised root pressed into my spine, and the ground was not comfortable, and the angle put me 3 feet from my son and 4 feet from Alara Wren. And she opened the small book she had brought, a collection of natural history illustrations, birds and insects and plants, each page a careful hand-drawn study with notes in a small, precise script. And Edmund leaned against her arm, and she showed him the pages, and I watched my son. And above us the chaffinch sang, and the lane lay quiet in the June afternoon. And I could not have told you what I felt precisely, except that it was large and it was warm, and it had something to do with both of them. I sat under the oak for, I think, 2 hours that afternoon. Alara showed Edmund the birds in the book 3 pages at a time, reading the notes in the small, precise script aloud in the same even, unhurried voice she used for everything. And Edmund asked questions, careful, specific questions, the questions of a child who has been thinking rather than a child who is simply filling silence. He asked about the black spots on the ladybird's wings and whether they meant anything. He asked why the fox's tail was called a brush. He asked, after some consideration, whether the bee on page 14 was the same kind of bee he had seen in the kitchen garden or a different kind. Alara said she was not entirely certain, but that she thought it was likely a different kind, because the bee in the picture appeared to have a longer body, and that if he saw the kitchen garden bee again, he should try to note whether it had yellow stripes at the front or the back or both. Edmund received this instruction with the seriousness of a field investigator receiving an assignment. I said nothing for most of the 2 hours. I sat on the root side of the oak with my back against the bark and watched the lane lie quiet in the afternoon and listened to them. And somewhere in the middle of the first hour, I realized that the particular pressure that lived behind my sternum, the one that had been there since December 3 years ago, since the fever and the 5 days and the morning I had walked into Aline's room and found the bed quiet, had eased a degree. Not gone, not healed, but eased the way a thing eases when it is not being held alone anymore. When she stood to go and dusted the grass from her skirt, she looked at me over Edmund's head. Just for a moment, a quick look that was checking whether I was still there, I thought. And then went to something more deliberate, something that said she was glad I was, and then she said good evening to both of us, and went down the lane. Edmund watched her go around the curve of the oaks. Then he turned to me and said, "The bee in the kitchen garden. I'm going to look at it tomorrow." I said that was a good plan. He climbed through the gap in the wall without further comment. I followed. But I walked back to the house slower than I normally walked, in the long evening light, with the pressure behind my sternum 1 degree lighter than it had been in 3 years. That was a Friday. I went back on the Monday. I went back on the Wednesday. By the following week, the arrangement had established itself as naturally as if it had always existed. 3 afternoons a week under the chestnut oak, or on a wide, flat stone by the small bridge where the lane crossed the ditch, or on the far side of the oak trees where there was a patch of long grass and clover that Edmund had decided was good for beetles. I sat on the root side. Edmund leaned against Miss Alara. She brought things, the natural history book, a piece of chalk for drawing in the dirt, a length of string for a game I did not know the rules of but which Edmund picked up in 4 minutes. I brought nothing the first week, because it had not occurred to me to bring anything. The second week I brought a journal I had found in the library, an old one of my own from when I was young, in which I had made sketches of birds on the estate. Edmund took it from me and opened it on his lap and examined each page with the seriousness of a scholar. He said, "You drew these." I said I had. I was 14 when I drew most of them, which was perhaps 10 years before the quality of my draftsmanship had fully resolved, but the likeness was honest enough. He looked at a page for a long time. He said, "This one has 3 legs." I said I had been uncertain about the 3rd leg and had put it in tentatively and then not removed it. Edmund looked at the bird and then at me and then at Miss Alara. He said, "Can I keep it?" I said he could. He held the journal on his lap for the rest of the afternoon with both hands. I told Alara Wren the truth of it over those weeks, in fragments, the way truth comes when you are not deliberately telling it, but simply being in a place long enough that the things you have not said begin to say themselves. I told her about Alina, not the whole of it, not at first, but pieces. That she had been the warmth of the house, that she had died in December 3 years ago, that I had not been good at replacing what she had provided, that the hall had gone quiet and Edmund had gone quieter, and that I had managed the estate and managed Edmund and managed my grief with efficiency and without warmth, which is the only way I had known to manage anything at all. Alara listened the way she listened to Edmund, the complete attention. The world paused. She did not offer comfort or platitude. She said once, "You have been holding him up all this time." Not as praise, as an observation, even when you didn't know how. I said I had tried. She said, "He knew you were behind the wall." I said I suspected he had. She said, "Children know where their parents are, even when the parents think they are hidden." I looked at Edmund, who was at that moment lying on his back in the long grass on the other side of the ditch, looking up at the sky with the concentration of someone who has found something of interest up there and is determining what it is. He looked, for the first time since Alina died, like a boy who was comfortable. Alara looked at him too. She said in a lower voice, "He told me the second week that his mother was in heaven and that she had been very warm and that he missed her." She paused. He said it once and then he went back to the beetle he had been looking at, but he said it. I said nothing for a moment. She said he wanted someone to know. I said quietly, I should have been the one he told. She looked at me, she said, "You will be, he is getting there." A pause, "You both are." The ditch beetle was apparently very good, because Edmund lay in the grass observing it for another 20 minutes before he came back. He arrived with grass in his hair and a piece of wet mud on his coat sleeve, and an expression of concentrated satisfaction. He climbed onto the flat stone beside Alara and looked at her and said, "The beetle went under the water." She said, "Did it drown?" He shook his head with the gravity of an eyewitness. "It had a bubble, around it, the whole beetle." He indicated the approximate size of the bubble with his fingers. "An air pocket, it was breathing." Alara looked at him. "Edmund," she said, "that is extraordinary." He absorbed this for a moment, and then his whole face changed. It did not transform dramatically. He was too composed for drama. But the composed surface of it did something, shifted in some internal way, and what came through was something like light. I watched my son look like that, and I thought, this is the thing I have been watching for 6 weeks. Not the leaning, or the collar, or the afternoon, or the beetle. This, the look on his face when he is seen, when what he has noticed is noticed back. The moment of being known, which is what children need more than food, more than warmth, more than anything, to be seen and known by someone who is glad to know them. I said to Alara that evening when Edmund had gone back through the wall, "I do not know how to thank you." She was gathering her cloak. She said without false modesty, "I haven't done anything that wasn't its own pleasure." I said, "You have, you gave him that." I found I did not have the right word for what she had given Edmund. I said, "That look, the look he has when he says something and you see it." She stopped, she held her cloak in her hands and looked at me. I said I was so concerned after Alina died with giving him everything he needed that I did not always see him. I managed him. I stopped. I was better at providing than at noticing. A long pause in the lane. The church clock in the village struck the half-hour. She said, "You notice now." I said, "I'm learning too." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was steady and warm, and that I had seen her turn on Edmund and never until that moment on me. She said, "That counts for more than you know, Your Grace." She left down the lane. I watched her go until the oaks curved and she was gone, and then I stood in the lane for a while longer in the late afternoon light. There were things a man did not say easily. I was not a man who had ever needed to say difficult things, not in the years before Alina died, because Alina was warm enough for both of us and had always known what I meant before I found the words, and not in the 3 years after, because the difficulty of grief was private and I had managed it privately. I had managed everything privately. It was the only method I knew. She had a way of listening that made the private manageable. Not easy, nothing she did made difficulty easy, because she was not the kind of woman who softened things into something they were not. But she received what I said with the same complete, genuine attention she gave to beetles and birds and chaffinches, and whatever I said did not get smaller or stranger in her hearing. It stayed the size it was. I thought about that on the walk back to the house, through the kitchen garden, through the long grass of the orchard. I thought about it in the library that evening, with the fire and a book I did not read. The house was very quiet. It was the same quiet it had been for 3 years, the managed quiet of a household that runs efficiently and without friction, and for the first time in 3 years it occurred to me that I was tired of quiet, that I had been managing the quiet because there was nothing to fill it with. That there might now be something. I wrote to Hartwell that evening. I told him about the oak and the 2 hours and the ladybird and the thing with the pressure behind my sternum. I did not tell him what I suspected I was beginning to feel, because I was not ready to name it in ink, but I told him the rest of it, and Hartwell wrote back inside the week with the brevity of a man who understood what was in what he was not being told. "Good. About time. Don't delay the gate." I did not delay the gate, not for long. Over the following weeks, June turning toward July, the oaks thickening and the lane deepening into high summer, the wildflowers going from cowslip to oxeye to the tall purple spikes of vetch. Things changed between me and my son in the way that things change when they are happening quietly and from the inside, not when they are forced. He began to speak to me in the evenings at the end of the day about what had happened at the oak tree, the beetle, the book, the string game, the bird. Small reports. The equivalent of what another child might chatter about at the dinner table, but Edmund's version, which was measured and factual and precious to me, in exactly the proportion that it was measured and factual, because it was his. He showed me the journal, my old journal with the 3-legged bird, at the end of a week. He had been keeping it in his room. He showed it to me with the particular expression of a child displaying something he has decided to trust you with. He said, "I've been adding to it." He had. In the back pages, in the loose, uneven pencil of a 5-year-old who is teaching himself to draw, there were birds. His birds were unlike mine. They had a quality of motion that mine lacked because he did not know to worry about stillness. He drew what he saw, which was birds that moved. The chaffinch from the oak had 3 or 4 of its own pages. The ditch beetle had 2. He said, "Miss Alara said beetles count as natural history." I said they absolutely did. He said, "She says everything counts." I sat with the journal in my hands, looking at his drawings, and I thought, yes, that is exactly what she does. She makes everything count. Every beetle, every three-legged bird, every boy who sits under an oak tree in a lane and is not sure anyone can see him. She saw him. I went to call on her formally at the rectory on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of July. I had thought about it for a week and consulted Hartwell, who had said, in the brisk tone of a man who has been waiting for this moment, "For God's sake, Gideon, just go," and had accompanied me to the end of the drive and then gone back to the hall because it was not the kind of call that required a second. The vicar, Mr. Pendle, was a pleasant, anxious man who was clearly not sure what to do with a duke in his morning room. He said Mrs. Pendle was resting, which was where she usually was, and offered me tea and biscuits with the air of someone who hopes the refreshments will establish a convivial atmosphere and perhaps explain why the Duke of Calenmore has come to call on a Thursday morning. I said I had come to see Miss Wren. He sent for her, and she came down in a plain afternoon dress, not expecting a caller, with a pencil still in her hand because she had been marking something for the children's lessons. She stopped in the doorway and looked at me with the alert, waiting expression that I had learned was her version of composure in an unexpected situation. I said, "I will not detain you long." I was standing because Mr. Pendle was standing, and I could feel the vicar in the corner of the room waiting with great attentiveness. I said, "I wish to tell you formally that your friendship with Edmund has meant a great deal, to him and to me." I paused. "And to ask whether you would consider, formally, accepting an invitation to continue making his acquaintance, with my understanding of who you are and with the gate open, rather than the gap in the wall." The pencil in her hand, her eyes on my face. She said carefully, "The gate." I said Calenmore Hall has a proper eastern gate, wider than the gap, better for the boots. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. I said, "And Edmund would like to show you his pony. He has mentioned it on 4 separate occasions in the past week, which I believe constitutes a standing invitation." She looked at me for a long moment. The vicar had, with commendable delicacy, retreated to the far end of the room and was examining a bookshelf with intense concentration. She said, "I would like to see the pony." I said, "Thursday, if that suits." She said Thursday suited. I said, "Miss Wren." I stopped. What I wanted to say was complicated, and I was not sure of the right words, and I have never been a man who speaks well in the moments that matter, which is the great irony of a man in a position that requires frequent speeches. I said, "You gave my son something that I was not able to give him. I know that. I was watching when you gave it to him." I looked at the pencil in her hand, and the open, steady quality of her attention, and the expression on her face that was ready to hear whatever came next. "I am very grateful." She said, "Don't be grateful," not unkindly, quietly, steadily, "just keep coming to the lane." I said I intended to. The Thursday visit it was everything Edmund had advertised. The pony was named Nutmeg, a fact Edmund had mentioned twice daily since Monday, and Nutmeg was a bay pony of good temperament and great patience, which were characteristics she would need, as Edmund's instructions to Alara about the pony were extensive and precise and occupied most of the first quarter hour. Alara listened to all of them. She said at one point, "Does she like apples?" Edmund looked at her as if this were a question of some complexity, and said he believed she did, but that it would need to be tested, and they spent the next portion of the visit testing it, which Nutmeg confirmed. I watched the two of them in the stable yard in the July light. Edmund was standing at the pony's shoulder, one hand on the neck in a proprietary way, explaining something, I could not hear what, but the explanation appeared to require some gesturing. Alara was looking at Nutmeg with the complete and genuine attention she gave to everything, and she said something back that made Edmund stop explaining and look at the pony and then look at Alara and say something else with great urgency. She laughed. I heard it from where I was standing across the yard. It was not a pretty produced laugh, but an actual one, surprised and genuine, and Edmund's face did the thing with the light again. I thought I have been watching from behind a wall for 6 weeks, and I did not know that there was a laugh that could do that to his face. I thought, I do not want to watch from behind a wall anymore. I said nothing that day. We took tea in the garden after the stable, the 3 of us, and Edmund drank his milk with a seriousness that suggested he was thinking about Nutmeg's opinion of apples. And Alara told me about the rectory children, the vicar's 3, who were 7 and 5 and 3, and who had their own personalities and complexities. And I told her something about the estate's history, because she asked, with the genuine interest that I was learning was her natural mode for everything. I told her about Eleanor, more of it, how she had come to Calenmore Hall as a bride, how she had loved the house and the chestnut oaks and the lane, how she had once found a lapwing nesting in the kitchen garden, and had had the whole kitchen garden fenced off for 6 weeks until the lapwings had hatched and flown, to the moderate irritation of the cook and the wholehearted approval of Edmund, who had not then been born but who I felt would have approved. Alara laughed at the lapwing story. She said, "Edmund will want to do the same thing someday." I said I suspected he would. She said, "Good." I looked at her. She was looking at Edmund, who had moved from the tea table to the edge of the garden where the herbaceous border met the lawn, and was examining something in the border with the beetle-examining expression. I said, "Good." She said, "Good that he'll be the kind of man who closes off the kitchen garden for a lapwing." I thought about that. I thought about Edmund grown, with Eleanor's pale brown eyes and, hopefully, Eleanor's warmth, and a lapwing in his kitchen garden, and a child of his own who leaned against someone's arm under an oak tree and watched chaffinches. I said quietly, "Yes." She looked at me then, and her expression was the one that was not performed. That was simply what she was, a warm and steady and genuinely present. She said, "He's going to be all right, you know." "Edmund," I said, "because of you." She shook her head. "Because of you, I just showed up in the lane." A pause. "You fixed the stone." I looked at my hands on the table. The weight of what she meant was in it, the loose stone left loose, the gap left open, the afternoons attended, all the watching which had not been nothing, all the showing up in the only way I had known how. She said, "It counts. Even watching from behind the wall counts." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Alara." She looked at me, and something in the quality of the attention shifted, because I had used her name for the first time, and she knew it. I said I would like to be in the lane, not behind the wall. She held very still. I said, "I am aware that this is more than asking you to visit the pony, and I am aware that there is a distance between a duke and a nursemaid at a rectory that is, by all social standards, a considerable one, and I am not unaware of what I am saying or what it might cost you." I stopped. I said, "But I have been watching you for 6 weeks, and I have been thinking about you for 6 weeks, and you told Edmund that everything counts, and I have decided that telling you this counts, even if you tell me you cannot accept it." She looked at the table, then she looked at Edmund, still absorbed in the border, then she looked at me. She said, "You are the Duke of Calenmore." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am nobody." I said carefully, "That is not." She said, "I know it isn't." "I'm not saying it the way you think I am." She looked at me steadily. "I mean that I have nothing. I have a position at a rectory and a cloak that is too heavy for May and a natural history book I saved for 6 months to afford. I have no family and no standing and no name that means anything in any county." A pause. "I have been sitting under a chestnut oak telling stories about foxes. That is, I know what I am, your grace. I am not foolish enough not to know the difference between what I am and what you are." I said, "I am a man who has been hiding behind a wall." She looked at me. Her expression had gone very still. I said, "I am a man who has been cold for 3 years and did not know how to stop being cold until a woman sat in the grass with my son and showed him how to breathe. I am a man who has a 5-year-old boy who leans against your arm and draws beetles in an old journal and says your handkerchief smells of lavender." I looked at her steadily. "That is what I am at the bottom of it, and I am telling you that if you are willing, I would like to learn to stop watching from the wall. With you, specifically." A long silence. The garden held it. Edmund was still in the border. The afternoon was warm and long and going nowhere in a hurry. She said in a very low voice, "Edmund needs." I said, "Edmund is not the reason I am saying this." She looked at me. I said, "Edmund is the reason I found you. What I feel when I watch you talk to him, when I watch you look at a beetle as if it is the most interesting thing in the world, when I watch you laugh at the pony, that is not a father's gratitude." I stopped. I did not know it would become this. I was watching because I could not stop watching, and I did not know what that meant for a very long time, and then I did. She looked at the table, she looked at the garden, she looked at Edmund. She said, "I am afraid." I said, "So am I." She looked at me, and something in the steadiness of her expression faltered. Just for a moment. Something that was recognition. That was the particular relief of a person who has been told that the thing they are feeling is also being felt on the other side. She said, what would this look like? I said slowly, carefully, in the lane to begin with, a pause, and with the gate open. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at me, and the warmth was back in her expression, and it was larger than I had seen it, and it was pointed directly at me in a way it had not been before, because before it had been for Edmund, and now it was for me. She said, I would like the gate open. I said, then we'll open it. We looked at each other across the table in the July afternoon, and it was a different kind of looking than anything that had come before. Not the watching from the wall, not the checked glances of the oak tree afternoons, but a direct thing. The two of us facing the same direction from the same table, and neither of us looking away. I could see in her expression the thing I had been reading for months without knowing what to call it. The warm, genuine presence of a woman who does not pretend to feel what she does not feel, and therefore, when she feels something, it is entirely real. She was looking at me the way she looked at the natural history book, the way she looked at Edmund's drawings, with that particular attention that said, this matters and I am not going to look away from it. I said her name again, Ilara. She said, yes. I said, I know that what I'm suggesting is that it will be talked about, that the county will have things to say and society in London will have things to say, and none of it will be kind. You are the nursemaid at the Aldervane Rectory, and I am the Duke of Calenmore, and people will say things about why a duke chooses a woman with nothing, and those things will be unpleasant to hear. I held her gaze. I want you to know that I know this, and that I intend to be very clear about my intentions from the beginning, so that there is no version of this in which you are anything other than what you are. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, what am I? I said, the woman who gave my son back to himself, the woman who knows what a bumblebee's stripes mean and why it matters, the woman who has been telling fox stories under a chestnut oak all summer and making me believe, one afternoon at a time, that warmth is something that can come back into a place that lost it. A pause. The woman I came out of the wall for. She pressed her lips together, briefly, the way she did when something affected her that she was not ready to put into words. She said, I am not afraid of what people will say. I said, what are you afraid of? She looked at her hands, then at me. She said softly that it works, that it is real, she stopped. I waited. She said, I have been careful these past weeks. Very careful not to let what I felt about the afternoons become something I was counting on. Because he is the Duke's son and she is nobody, and that is a very clear line in this world, and I know where I stand relative to it. She looked at me steadily. And now you are sitting across a table in July telling me the gate is open, and I am afraid because I have not been as careful as I thought I was. I said, good. She stared at me. I said, I mean that I am glad, that there is something to be careful about. That the care means something was worth protecting. I stopped. I was not saying it right. I said, I have not been careful enough either. I tried to be. I told myself it was the watching that kept Edmund safe. But it was not only that. It was not even mostly that. I held her gaze. I kept going back because you were there. A long pause. The garden held it. Edmund was still in the border. The afternoon was warm and long and going nowhere in a hurry. She said, I would like the gate open. I said, then we'll open it. And then Edmund called from the border, the bee is back, in the tone of a boy reporting significant news, and we both looked at him, and she said, what kind? And he said, big, dark. With yellow, and she said, a bumblebee most likely, and Edmund considered this and said, can you come and look? And she stood from the table and went to look at the bumblebee, and I sat in the garden of Calenmore Hall and watched her crouching in the border next to my son with her good dress in the dirt and her head tilted to see whatever Edmund was seeing, and I thought, yes. The stone in the wall, the gate left unlocked, the afternoon under the oak, the lavender handkerchief, the look on his face when she saw him, the way she said the words everything counts and meant them. Yes. I married Ilara Wren in October, in the chapel at Calenmore Hall, which had not seen a wedding since Aliner's, and which had been waiting, I thought, in the way old houses wait, for the warmth to come back. Edmund carried the ring, because he had asked to, and because I had said yes before I was entirely sure whether this was traditionally the role of the son or not, and when I had asked Ilara, she had said she could not imagine it any other way. He carried it on a small cushion that Mrs. Hargrove had embroidered for the purpose, in a very straight line from the chapel door to where we stood at the altar, with the concentration of a boy carrying the most important thing in the world. because as far as he was concerned, he was. She wore a gown of pale gold, not white, which was right, which was her, exactly her, and her hair was up with a few strands loose at the sides of her neck, which I had known would be the case even before I saw it, because it was always the case and it was part of her. The way the lavender handkerchief was part of her, and the pencil behind her ear was part of her, and the complete, full, genuine attention that she gave to everything in the world that deserved it was part of her. Hartwell stood at the back of the chapel and looked, when I glanced at him, like a man who was pleased with himself for excellent reasons. He caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, and I looked back at Alara, and she was looking at me, and the look was warm and steady, and not for anyone's benefit but ours. Edmund placed the cushion in my hands with solemnity, then stood beside us, which was not the traditional position either, but which was the only position that made sense. And the vicar, Mr. Pendle, who had been, I could tell, astonished and then steadily delighted by the entire development, said the words, and I said the words, and Alara said the words, and I slid the ring on her finger. It is 11 years ago now, as I write this. Edmund is 16, and he is tall and brown-haired and has his mother's pale eyes and his stepmother's way of looking at things, that absorbed, genuine attention. And he draws birds the way I drew them when I was 14, which is to say not quite right, but with a particular quality of motion in them that I have never managed. He draws them in a journal of his own now. He filled the original journal years ago. Alara last spring found a lapwing nesting in the kitchen garden and had the garden fenced off, to the moderate irritation of the cook and the wholehearted approval of Edmund and of all three of our daughters and of me. The lapwings hatched and flew in June. Edmund drew them. She still has the natural history book. The illustrations are loose at the spine now, from being handled so many times. She mended the binding twice, with the careful competence she applies to everything. She keeps it on the table in the morning room where the children can reach it. I walk past the eastern wall sometimes in the early mornings when the house is quiet. The old chestnut oak is still there. The lane is still there. The gap in the wall was filled years ago. The mason came, finally, and I did not tell him to leave it, but the gate is open, every morning without fail. I open it myself first thing. She asked me once, in the early years, why I always opened it myself, when Dawson could as easily do it. I said, because I am not hiding behind anything anymore. She looked at me, and the warmth of it was the thing I had been watching for from the beginning, the thing I could not name when I first saw it in the lane, warm, full, genuine. Not for anyone else, not performed. Mine. She said, "No, you're not." She put her hand in mine, and we went back into the house together, into the warmth of it.